For over 200 years, scientists have grappled with a question that was first hinted at by a man who was once the world's most famous naturalist and explorer, a man who rubbed shoulders with presidents and inspired both poets and revolutionaries, but now a man whose name has largely been forgotten outside of academia, Prussian naturalist Alexander von Humboldt. According to Humboldt, biodiversity should be the highest around the Earth's equator and taper off towards the poles due to climate and energy availability. However, Humboldt noted that this pattern doesn't seem to hold for one kind of habitat, mountains. And in 2019, scientists gave it a name, Humboldt's Enigma. So why are mountains so unexpectedly diverse? What's so special about the Caucasus Mountains in the country of Georgia in particular? And what's this got to do with the species of all-female lizards that reproduce via cloning? I did the only sensible thing and traveled across the world to find out. In June of 1802, Humboldt climbed Mount Chimborazo, a dormant volcano in the Andes in South America, which is technically the furthest point away from the center of the Earth, despite what Everest's PR team would have you believe. He was on a 5-year expedition with French botanist Aimé Bonpland, trekking thousands of miles through South America, studying tropical plants, mapping river systems, and trying not to get eaten by jaguars. Looking down at the valley below, Humboldt was suddenly struck by the interconnectedness of nature. After he returned home, he wrote that in this great chain of causes and effects, no single fact can be considered in isolation. And in doing so, founded the field of ecology. But the answer as to why mountains seem to break the pattern that he predicted eluded him. You see, mountains cover about a quarter of the Earth's surface, but are home to about 85% of the world's birds, mammals, and reptiles, most of which are completely endemic and don't occur anywhere else. In fact, nearly half of the world's 34 biodiversity hotspots are within mountain ecosystems. To investigate this, I flew to the Caucasus, an area about the size of France, where a full quarter of the plants are endemic, which is the highest rate in the Northern Hemisphere. This area stretches between the Black Sea in the west and the Caspian Sea in the east, and is like 2/3 just mountains. So after a quick 7-hour train ride from the capital of Tbilisi to the wonderfully named town of Zugdidi, followed by a totally safe 4-hour Mashika trip up into the mountains, I landed in the town of Mestia in the northern Caucasus chain, which had more than a little Wild West going for it, filled with wooden buildings and people moseying about on horses. Hiking up over the first ridge, Humboldt's Enigma was out on full display. Conifers, deciduous trees, and grasslands all faded into one another over the span of meters. Bright, multicolored displays of wildflowers blanketed the slopes. Rivers of glacier melt cut through the landscape. Through the eyes of an ecologist, this place is a paradise. So, why the extreme biodiversity? After returning from his trip in the Andes, Humboldt created this picture, called the Tiergemälde, which is considered to be one of the world's first infographics. It shows the data he collected, precise readings of things like temperature, soil conditions, and barometric pressure at various altitudes. It also shows drawings of how the plant species he found changed at different altitudes, with all their Latin names written in there for good measure. You see, every species occupies a niche, the combination of biotic and abiotic factors like rainfall, humidity, temperature, and soil type that they need in order to survive. What mountain ecosystems do is they cram together thousands of different niches in a relatively small area, which makes thousands of different ideal habitats for species that can't or don't want to live anywhere else. This massive variety in climate is caused by the elevation of the mountains themselves, and is known as climatic life zone compression. As I climbed, and climbed, and climbed, I felt the air getting colder, and patches of snow started to appear. That drop in temperature with altitude is known as the lapse rate, and is about 6.5 degrees per kilometer in mountains, all else being equal. To put it another way, walking 1 kilometer up a mountain in the Caucasus is around about the same as hiking 1,000 kilometers towards the North Pole. That has an impact on precipitation, like snow and rain, as well as on solar radiation because there are fewer molecules in the air, and effectively compresses many different habitats onto the same slope. Climbing north and down over the mountain, I saw far more snow than on the way up. That physical structure and orientation of the mountains, which is called topographical heterogeneity if you want to be fancy, changes the amount of solar radiation that they get. In the northern hemisphere, south-facing slopes will receive more sunlight, which warms them up and reduces the amount of snow cover, whereas north-facing slopes are more often covered in shade, means that they'll generally be colder and wetter and more covered in snow. The mountains themselves also change the direction of the wind, affecting the temperature and rainfall. Craggy, rocky mountains can also create what are known as microrefugia, where the environment behind a boulder can be completely different from the environment like 1 meter away. The mountains here were covered in folds, the strata almost vertical at times, and the kinds of rocks I saw varied dramatically from one spot to another. This whole range belongs to the Alpine mountain belt system, which was created through the collision of the Arabian plate, which has been crashing into the Eurasian plate at an alarming rate of 2.3 centimeters per year, pushing up Mesozoic sedimentary rocks and exposing the older Paleozoic and Precambrian igneous basement rocks. This creates what's called edaphic heterogeneity, which is a mosaic of different soil types which all have different properties, driving local niche differentiation and adaptation in plants. Two of the peaks, Mount Elbrus and Mount Kazbek, are also actually dormant volcanoes, and Mount Kazbek last erupted in about 750 BCE, which spewed out a huge amount of material, which also changed the properties of the soil. Finally, and this one's my favorite, mountains create what's known as the sky island effect. Species that have adapted to certain altitudes are often not able to survive in the valleys between those peaks. This essentially creates islands of habitat, where the peaks represent habitat that they can survive in, and the valleys represent death. This restricts the gene flow between the populations, driving localized adaptation and possibly speciation. So all those factors, how climatic life zone compression paired with edaphic and topographic heterogeneity are able to drive localized adaptations, explain why the mountains are so diverse. But what is it that sets the Caucasus apart? In order to understand that, we have to go back to the last glacial maximum, more commonly known as the Ice Age. So the Earth's experienced a bunch of ice ages, about 20 during the Pleistocene alone. They're mainly caused by Milankovitch cycles, which refer to patterns in the Earth's orbit around and angle toward the Sun. When the Earth's orbit becomes more elliptical, it's further away from the Sun for more of the time, making it colder. But generally, when we're talking about the Ice Age, we're talking about the one that happened most recently. And the peak of that Ice Age was known as the last glacial maximum. So the Ice Age was like not a good time, to put it mildly. A full quarter of the Earth's land area was covered in permanent summer ice, and most of the northern hemisphere was completely inhospitable. About 2/3 of the human species just flat out died, with the rest of them migrating south to warm climates. One of those refugia was the Caucasus, not just for humans, but for a host of different plant and animal species. But why didn't it just freeze over like the rest of Europe? The answer lies in its unique geography. You see, the Caucasus mountain range acted a little bit like the wall from Game of Thrones, keeping out the cold, protecting the valleys from the freezing winds coming down from Siberia. The Black Sea to the west acted like a hot water bottle. Water can retain a lot more thermal energy than land can, and so it absorbed the energy from the sun during the summer and then radiated that heat out during the winter. Since the winds at that latitude mostly blow from the west, the wind picked up all that heat as it blew over the Black Sea and then was funneled through the valleys of the Caucasus, warming them up. Not a huge amount, but enough to keep everything from dying. The south-facing slopes of the mountains were able to absorb more sunlight, preventing the glaciers from extending down into the lowlands and keeping them fragmented in the valleys between the peaks. Because of that, many of the species who had adapted to the colder climates in the higher altitudes were simply able to migrate down into the valleys in order to survive. So the Caucasus acted like a refuge for species to be able to survive through the last glacial maximum. But that doesn't alone account for the crazy levels of biodiversity. The last piece of the puzzle is that the repeated cycles of glaciation during the Pleistocene acted like an evolutionary pump. During times of glaciation, populations were fragmented from each other. That allowed for localized adaptations to occur, and maybe even speciation. Then, when the populations were able to reintegrate with one another, when the ice retreated, they were able to interbreed, and sometimes forming hybrids, but bringing back together all of that biodiversity that they had accrued after being separated for so long. But what does that have to do with asexual lizards? Humboldt returned to Europe in 1804, and Europe lost its collective shit. After years of rumors that he'd been killed by jaguars, died of yellow fever, or eaten by indigenous tribes, he brought back 60,000 plant specimens. He was treated like an elite foreign diplomat by American President Thomas Jefferson. He became a fixture of high society galas and salons, and he even exhibited all of his work at the National Institute in France, where he was mobbed by crowds of fans. Simon Bolivar said that it was his conversations with Humboldt that led to his revolutionary ideals and the eventual independence of, and I'm going to have to check this, Bolivia, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela from Spanish rule. His expeditions became known as the second scientific discovery of America, and writers at the time said that he was the second most famous person in the world, losing out only to Napoleon.
Shall we vote?
Charles Darwin said that it was Humboldt who inspired him to start his own expedition on the Beagle, which led to Darwin developing the theory of evolution. After the release of The Origin of Species, Darwin focused on reproduction and released his findings in his book The Descent of Man. In that book, Darwin was mostly focused on human reproduction because when it comes to animals, reproduction gets weird. Most animals make more animals the old-fashioned way. But in some species, the females literally don't need no man and are able just to clone themselves. Something I'm sure about half of you are quite envious of. This process is called parthenogenesis and mostly happens in invertebrates like bees, ants, wasps, and aphids. In vertebrates, it's basically unheard of, like never happens. Out of all of the vertebrate species that we know, only 90% of them are fully parthenogenic, which is essentially just a rounding error. But for some reason, a full 20% of the species in this one family of lizards called Dorevskia in the Caucasus are fully parthenogenic. What the hell is going on there? The answer lies in those periods of glaciation during the Ice Age. Initially, the ranges of these different species of lizards didn't overlap all that much, but then due to the glaciers encroaching down from the mountains, they were forced together into the lowlands and started to interact with each other a little bit more often. This resulted in them forming hybrids. Now, hybrids in nature are not that uncommon, but there's a little bit of a tension there. You see, if the genetics of two species are too different, like an elephant and a lion, they won't be able to make hybrids at all. If they are similar enough, like a lion and a tiger, they will be able to make a hybrid, but it's probably going to be infertile. If the species are too similar to each other, they'll be able to make a hybrid, which will then be fertile, and then will probably be co-opted back into one of the populations of those parent species. This is actually the mechanism by which genes can jump from one species to another, known as introgression, and is exactly the way that most Europeans ended up with Neanderthal DNA.
What'd they die of?
Crushed pelvises.
Yes!
But somewhere in that spectrum of similarity lies the tiny, tiny chance that the parent species are similar enough to be able to produce hybrids, different enough for those hybrids not to be co-opted back into the parent populations, and also for some reason have some mutations that allow them to make clones of themselves. But how does that even work? Hybrids are usually infertile because the chromosomes of each parent could be too different, or there could be a mismatch in the number of them. That means that during meiosis, the chromosomes can't be separated properly, and so won't be able to make functional gametes, sperm or egg cells. Meiosis has a bunch of built-in checks to prevent gametes that are non-functional from being produced in the first place. But these lizards have found a way around that, a sort of spit and duct tape, there I fixed it, MacGyver sort of solution. They actually double the number of chromosomes in the cell before meiosis happens, as well as turning off some of those checks. Then the bivalents, the pairs of identical chromosomes, are able to separate, and then the rest of the process goes on as usual. However, instead of ending up with eggs that have half the number of chromosomes, each egg now has the same number of chromosomes as the mother. And voila, clone babies. Now the problem with clones is that they're, well, clones. They don't have any genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction evolved for a reason. It changes up genomes, it shakes things up, and allows for new adaptations to occur. Cloning doesn't allow for that, and so clones should theoretically be outcompeted by their sexy cousins. Why do these lizards still exist? Think about it like this. The genetics of each parent species were primarily adapted to an environment that wasn't an ice age. During periods of glaciation, they were migrating down from the mountains and trying to find habitats that suited them, but they were probably still not ideal. Now, these hybrids that emerged were kind of an evolutionary roll of the dice. They represented a reset in a way. They had the opportunity to essentially become a whole new species, one that was more adapted to the environments at the time. And because of that, they could thrive. On a less dramatic scale, this is known as heterozygote fitness, the observation that individuals with quite genetically dissimilar parents tend to outcompete their weird inbred cousins. Then, because every individual in these species were female, they were able to reproduce at a much faster rate than all the other species in the family. Also, the females in these Derivskia species are way more chill than the males. They're far less territorial and aggressive, and that meant that these all-female clone species were able to exist at much greater population densities and population numbers than the ones with males. And that allowed them to weather the storms of the Ice Age, which allowed them to survive. But if there are clones, and clones are bad at adapting, how did they survive the end of the Ice Age? Why are they still around? Well, the answer again lies in the biogeography of the mountains. After the Ice Age ended, they were able to move up the slopes to stay in the niches that they occupied and that they could survive in. The mountains acted as a safety net, caring for the life that they helped create. 200 years ago, Alexander von Humboldt climbed a mountain looking for order in nature and noticed that mountains seemed to break the rules of biodiversity. Today, we have an answer to Humboldt's enigma. Mountains don't just preserve life, they create the conditions that drives evolution in order to manufacture it. Every slope, every valley, every mountaintop becomes an opportunity for natural selection to experiment with what life could be. They act as nurseries, cultivating and protecting innumerable species. And perhaps nowhere is that more on display than in the Caucasus Mountains. If you made it this far, I just want to say thanks. This was a lot of work. If you enjoyed that, I have another video in the works that I shot on my trip to the island of Rhodes about pollen cores and how they can influence conservation approaches by going back in time to figure out what environments actually existed thousands of years ago. So if you're into that sort of thing, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.